This Anzac Day, we remind you of one of the great tragedies of World War II. The Centaur was an Australian hospital ship. It sailed out of Sydney on May 12, 1943, with 332 people on board. Being a hospital ship, this was carrying wounded soldiers, nurses, men and women. Only 64 people survived after it was torpedoed out of nowhere. And then those that survived spent more than 35 hours in the water. Joining me now is the CEO of This Story Australia, Geoff Hughes, who's been commissioned to make a documentary about Centaur. This was one of those stories, Geoff, that really struck me. And it's something that I have done a lot of work on and around with families involved for quite some years, because the Centaur was only found in 2009. Tell us what drew you to this story.
Yeah, well, we've had, first of all, thanks very much for having me on this morning. We've had a lot of interest from the community in regards to commemorating special events. And I know the government's looked at 80 years since World War II. There's a lot of things that pop up in the calendar, but one of the largest tragedies to occur just off the coast here in Queensland was the sinking of the Centaur. And we've been quietly working on this project since 2019. So to put together a feature-length documentary with the untold stories of the families that have endured the intergenerational trauma, really, since then, it's just really, really an important story.
It certainly is. And I mentioned at the outset, it was one of the great tragedies, I think, of the Second World War. You know, there's so much death and destruction that we can talk about, but this was a hospital ship. There were sick people on board and it was torpedoed really out of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's really interesting once you do a deep dive into the history and you do the research of the personal accounts from people who were there. The hospital ship was illuminated very well. In the middle of the morning, it was sunk just after 4 a.m. And, Red Crosses were identifying it. Its route was actually charted, so people knew that it was on voyage up to Papua New Guinea. And regardless, what stands out in spite of all of that is in a ruthless act of war, it was just laid to rest at the bottom of the ocean, 2,000 meters down.
Yeah, in 2009, I remember speaking a lot to David Mearns, who's a shipwreck hunter. He found the Centaur off the coast of Queensland, as you mentioned. And what always strikes you about shipwrecks is that they are almost like a time capsule. The preservation of some of those items on board the Centaur is extraordinary when you see that. But this was one that really captured Australians and their imaginations as well, because of what you talk about there, about how shocking it was and remains at the time. Why do you think, you're working on a documentary now, what do you think has really captured the hearts and minds of Australians about this particular story?
I think what the documentary really brings to the forefront is how we commemorate these past events, but also the feelings that we can associate our everyday lives with the people who have gone through loss, and how that stays with them through generations. And I think that's really important to remember. We, personally may not have been on the battlefield, but we still have those emotions of anxiety and loss and adrenaline. And so the stories may be a little bit different, but we have that connection through that human emotion.
Yeah, we certainly do. Geoff, remind me, are there any living survivors left from the Centaur tragedy?
No, there's not. All of the survivors have passed. We're left with family members, who were 6, 7, 8 years old at the time, and some of them have memories of their relatives, and some of them don't, and that's been wrestled away from them. So
Yeah.
Honoring the memories of their ancestors, of their grandfathers, of their family members is really important to them, and that's why one of the reasons Anzac Day turns out these big crowds, because we share it with the younger generation. And Jan Thomas from the Centaur Association says it really best. We give people a reason to remember, and they will.
Yeah, very well said. I remember speaking to Jan, and look, I was lucky enough to speak to some of the families at the time back in 2009 when the Centaur was found. What are the families? Are you dealing with the families a lot at the moment? How do they feel about this anniversary coming up?
Well, they're scattered across Australia. There's a lot down in Sydney. There's Nambucca Heads, Caloundra. There's a lot of different regions that have a memorial service for the Centaur, and that's on the 14th of May every year. This year is the 80th anniversary, so it's particularly significant. And I know the documentary will be screening on Sunday, May 14th, up at the Caloundra RSL. So that's an opportunity for people who at least live locally to not only go to the commemoration services that have been organized for the day, but also to come and reflect on, why it's important that we pass on these memories, and why it's important that we don't forget.
Well, Jeff, it's great to talk to you this morning, and I thank David Burns for putting us in touch too.
Yeah, absolutely. It was delightful to hear from his recommendation and getting in touch. And hopefully, these sort of commemorative pieces remain as really pertinent in the Australian consciousness.
I think so too. Jeff, this is not the last time we're going to speak. We're going to speak again soon. We look forward to hearing updates about your project.
Great. Thanks very much for having me.